So I recently realized I've been accumulating a bunch of swords without really making videos about them. And, well, that is because, of course, I have a lot of backlog of stuff I want to make videos about. So it takes time to get to some of the swords. But it's also because I tend to want to do my research beforehand, and rather than just show something that I'm not 100% sure of what it may be or what it is, I want to be able to communicate something useful to you guys. However, occasionally there are some swords that are near impossible or difficult to identify. And today we're looking at one of these. So the reason I haven't been talking about the sword is that I was hoping to find a bunch more information, but I'm realizing it's easier said than done. So I actually thought I'd just talk about it and show it close up, and maybe some of you guys have information about it. So we will go the opposite direction and maybe you guys can educate me. But I will try and tell you what I do know about this sword and what I do think about it. So if you're familiar with some of my previous videos, you will probably recognize this one. I think I showed it in a couple of videos already, but I definitely talked about it in detail when I talked about that ninja transformed into a carabella. Just to kind of repeat for whoever didn't see that video, I got this one because I was interested in the blade, and I was interested in the pommel because the pommel is a typical Swiss dog head pommel. This is a fairly easy characteristic to recognize in Swiss swords. So I didn't have one, I had never seen one live, and this one came out at a pretty good price, I thought. So I decided to pick it up. I was, however, a little concerned with the hilt assembly. I'll show it to you really quickly before we do the deep dive. But you may see, I'm not sure how it comes through on camera, but the color of the different alloys, the color of the alloys of the different parts of the hilt seems different. And this kind of makes me think that it's a later composite. Which was slightly disappointing because while I kind of knew what I was getting into when I bought it, I didn't expect them to be so different. When you're live, the difference is actually pretty striking, I would say. Also, the difference in style. So it really feels more like just mishmash of parts rather than a composite of the time, let's say. But what was not a disappointment was the blade. So anyway, first of all, it comes with its beautiful antique scabbard. I'm not sure how I would date this, but I would say probably 18th, late 18th to early 19th century would be where I would place this scabbard. But the blade was really, really interesting because I expected it to be a hopefully early 17th, hopefully early 18th to late 17th, let's say mid 17th to early 18th century blade. But when I shared it on one of the communities, a rather experienced member said that in his opinion this is a 16th century blade, so way older than I initially thought, that has then eventually at some point in history been rehilted onto this unsightly hilt, slightly unsightly. In his opinion, this is a storta blade from Belluno. Belluno was a big center for weapons production. It's a center, a hub that is kind of goes under the radar of many collectors, or at least many non-specialized collectors. You'll often hear a lot of talk about Solingen and Toledo as like the big centers, but don't let that fool you because sword making was present in a lot of more, maybe with less volume, although it's arguable for Belluno, I would say, but perhaps with even higher quality or different style or different type of steel working, for example. Belluno, I mentioned, it might not have been lower quantity than Solingen because it was the main supplier for weapons for the Venetian Republic. So this means that a lot of the Schiavona blades you find, a lot of the Venetian swords that are marked with the Venetian arsenal or with the CX of the Council of the Ten. Many of these swords come from Belluno. How can you tell? Well, there is a number of maker's marks that are typical of Belluno, and also a lot of sword makers' names that are typical of Belluno, and you'll often find on blades from the Middle Ages to the 18th century, perhaps. This is all for another video, though, because it's actually a really interesting topic, and it could be, you could really dive into a lot of detail about it. However, the opinion I have heard, and which I hope is true, because I would be very happy to own a storta blade, is that this is a 16th century Belluno storta blade. The size is pretty consistent with what I've seen of some Belluno stortas, at least. There's obviously a lot of variation, but at a total of 74 centimeters, this is consistent with what you would expect. Apparently the fuller configuration, which we'll also look at in detail in just a second, is also consistent, as is the slight widening towards the tip. It's really, really slight, but there is a slight... you will see some way more extreme. Some have like a very broad yeoman over on the counter edge. So yeah, this is all I can really say about this sword in terms of its model, typology, let's say provenance, and history, which is not much, I realize. But that's why we're going to look at it in detail, look at all of its features, and hopefully if you guys recognize anything, have some feedback, have some feeling of what it may be or what you think it is, just let me know in the comments. I'm always happy to hear. Okay, so we'll start by taking a full look at the whole ensemble, so sword and scabbard. And that is because this scabbard was definitely made for this blade. So I think it's an important part of the historical piece itself. Actually, we'll start by looking at the scabbard, because then we can focus on the rest. So you'll see the scabbard fits almost perfectly, not exactly perfectly. There's a little bit of deviation there where it doesn't cover exactly. It doesn't connect exactly to the crossguard here, to the hilt, but overall it does a pretty good job. We have a brass throat that's fixed in place with simply without a staple, but with two like divots, and this hanging button. So the way this would have been hung is like a hunting hanger or like a briquette. So this button would kind of be passed through a hole in a bandolier and then hung that way. The leather is a beautiful dark brown. It's in fairly good condition still, I would say. There are some areas of drying here, so it will need a little bit of curing at some point. But it's overall in very sturdy shape. There's no flaking, no broken seams either. So if you look at the stitches, I always find that really interesting and beautiful. So we see the stitching is not super precise. So you see that the top part here deviates from the center and kind of runs down the center for the rest of the scabbard. And at the end, again, it deviates to the same side here. Overall, though, very solid. So this is actually a leather scabbard that when you remove, doesn't flop around or bend. So I wonder, I don't think it has any wooden reinforcement within it, but I could be wrong. Moving on to the shape, we have, again, brass with a very prominent ball at the end, and again, fixed in place, not necessarily by a staple, although this little horizontal line may say that there was a staple at some point, but we just have two little divots there to keep it in place. And oh, and it's not as solid as I thought, so this I'm not going to touch because yeah, it does move around a little bit. So time to remove the sword. You'll feel a very satisfactory sound because it's very snug in the scabbard. And we'll start with the hilt because although interesting, this is the part that I think is the least interesting about this sword. I mentioned, and I think you will be able to see it now, how different the color of the alloys of the different elements is. So the pommel has this really bright yellow brass color to it. This section here, it almost looks like the kind of knuckle guard you would find on some later naval swords. So like this twisted metal, and then like some kind of monster head, or like a sea monster or fish head. In fact, if you look at this one, it could almost be some kind of a fish or something. You see the mouth here and this weird hump on the top. So yeah, so something's going on here. And then the wrapping here seems to me a little bit too modern, honestly, and too perfectly precise. And again, a different color from both. This one almost has a coppery sheen to it at some point, like here on this side you'll see it almost reddish. At least that's what it looks like in real life, although here you see a very clear brassy yellow to it, so hard to tell what it is. Everything is held together up here by a ring. Not held together, but a ring kind of covers the juncture point. And that's all we can say. I just want to quickly show you the doghead pommel, because whether or not this was its original pommel, which I seriously doubt, the doghead pommel is a typical feature of many Swiss swords. These come in countless variations. Again, more realistic versions, more stylized versions. Some look really ugly and a little bit comical. Some look quite realistic. So yeah, so it's hard to really, again, classify them. But when you see a doghead pommel, it's not exclusively, but very typically Swiss. If we look at the peen area here, I feel like this gives us a little bit of, says something here, because, well, we see the peen coming through, but we also see that the head of the dog here has been a little smashed. At least you can even see it right here. The kind of folding of the metal, I think, created this lip down on the back of the head. So I think someone definitely adapted this and then probably ground this smooth. This is my impression or my feeling. So what do you think? In any case, even for being a composite, the pieces fit surprisingly well together, I would say. I've seen some composites where you actually have like half a centimeter of misalignment between, for example, the pommel and the grip, because they use the different parts. This is not the case here. Same goes for this hole under the dog's mouth here on the dog's neck, where the knuckle guard kind of fits. It fits really snugly. So whoever made this composite at least knew what they were doing, I would say. And if not in terms of accuracy, like of metal accuracy, let's say, at least in terms of fitting the parts together. So yeah, as mentioned, I don't know much about this. We have a dog head, we have this weird sea monster head or something like that. This is actually a quite beautiful knuckle guard. I like this style very much. Even it's not for the minimalist, let's just say that. Moving on to the blade, which is the most interesting part, I would say. I haven't cleaned this one yet ever since I got it. First of all, because it's in fairly good condition, but also I want to make sure that I'm cleaning this one in the right way. I try to do it with all my swords, of course, but I want to be a little more careful with a potentially 500-year-old sword than I would be necessarily with a 20th century sword mass-produced. So, thickness of the blade is not indifferent. It's, I would say, 3 to 4 centimeters, and that width seems to be consistent all across the blade, with perhaps a slight thickening in this section towards the end. The blade, as you can see, is slightly curved in a typical storta fashion, or in the same fashion you would find in later briquettes or some hunting hangers, which makes me think that if this scabbard is indeed 18th century, This may have been a repurposing, maybe for civilian use, exactly as a hunting weapon, or maybe military, I don't know, but that's my impression. What's interesting about this blade are the fullers, I would say. You have one broader fuller at the center, and this one runs basically all the way up to, well, practically the tip. And then you have other two fullers flanking it. These are thinner, more narrow, and they kind of run along. One stops really early at the fourth, fifth, I would say, and the other continues, well, almost to the same length as the central one, not exactly, but it kind of tapers into nothing, I would say here. These fullers are present on both sides, as you can see, and they tend to stay on the top half of the blade. So the edge, the cutting section is quite smooth instead. What's interesting about these fullers is that they're definitely handmade, and not roughly necessarily, but you do see some imprecisions. So you'll see, for example, here, this fuller starts really narrow, then kind of thickens here, and then kind of recorrects towards as it goes on. Whereas on this side, you'll see the fuller starts actually, the beginning of the gouging starts right at the end of the blade here. So these are a few interesting features, I think, that show that at least these were not an industrial kind of production. The blade then has, sorry, the sword has these incisions on the spine. So it seems to me that there's an X here. This is possibly a Roman numeral 1. Here we have some V's, maybe another X, another 1. I don't know what these are. I don't know if these are purely for decoration, if they represent, for example, a date, or if it's some kind of pattern that perhaps was added at some point. Maybe it's just notches someone put in when using it as a hunting sword for bears they killed. I don't know. In any case, talking to the expert that ventilated the possibility that this may be a Belluno sword, he is of the opinion that these were added later. Now, coming to what really makes this sword interesting more than any other characteristic we've seen so far are these three marks. These are called flies or knots. You'll find different definitions for them, but it's a mark that is very typical of Belluno sword makers. They come in a lot of different shapes and a few different configurations, so you often will have them in these in groups of 3. You may have them together with, for example, like the eyelash, the reverse eyelash symbols. You may sometimes have them on their own, like just one of these marks. So nobody really knows exactly what they represent or what they mean, or even what the different variations of these mean. But they do tend to all represent swords made in the Belluno area. So if we look at them close up, it's really hard to tell what exactly they are. Maybe knot is the most correct term for them. But they do seem to have a kind of general X shape to them. And then they often have little elements, extra elements in the center, like protruding. These almost look like a little butterflies to me, in a sense. But yeah, this is the only thing I can tell you about the Belluno marks, because there is not much information, and as I mentioned, there are a lot of variations. What's interesting here to me is that you can see some, I think you can see some like layering of the steel here, or in some spots, which is to me very interesting. I'm not a steel expert, but it's always interesting to see how the edge of a sword kind of develops. And what's also interesting about this sword is that it is sharp. This, not sharp, not razor sharp, but if someone swung this against you, you would probably get a very bad gash, if not lose a limb from it. So it's still in serviceable and serviced condition, I would say. Anyway, this is all I can tell you really about this sword. I love it. It's the idea that this blade may be that old and has gone through all of this kind of damage, obviously, if it's lost its original hilt, and then be reconnected to something else over time, and someone made a scabbard for it, and all the way through centuries it came down to me, is really one of the reasons why I enjoy collecting swords so much. So I hope you enjoyed this video too. If you have any insights or anything I didn't mention or anything I said incorrectly or any thoughts about this sword and its potential of being a Belluno storta, I would love to hear your thoughts. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next sword video. Bye!